Under the mound at Jericho, there is a stone tower. It stands about 28 feet high. It is built of undressed stone laid without mortar, and inside it there is a staircase of 22 steps running up through the middle of the stonework. It was built around 8,000 years before Christ. It is the oldest structure of its kind anywhere on Earth. It was already ancient when the first pyramid was cut, and nobody has ever been able to say with confidence what it was for. Here is the ground we are going to cover tonight. 4 excavations at the same mound, across 120 years, by 4 people who each believed the ones before them had got it wrong. What each of them actually found in the ground with their own hands, where they agree, which is far more of it than you would expect, and where they disagree, which comes down in the end to a single century and a question about pottery. We are going to go slowly, and we are going to stay with what came out of the earth. The place is called Tel Es Sultan, and it sits about a mile northwest of the modern town of Jericho, in the floor of the Jordan Valley. A tell is not a hill. A tell is a mound made by people, built up layer on layer over thousands of years, each town leveling the ruins of the last one and building on top of it. This one stands about 70 feet above the plain around it, and that 70 feet is not soil. It is somewhere in the order of 20 successive settlements, one on top of another, pressed down into a single mound. And the reason 20 towns were built in exactly this one place is a spring. It is called Ain Es Sultan, and it is still running. It comes out of the ground at the eastern foot of the mound, and it puts out something in the region of 1,000 gallons a minute, every minute, in a valley that is one of the hottest and driest inhabited places on the surface of the earth. Jericho sits about 850 feet below sea level. In summer, the heat is very hard. And there, at the foot of that mound, cold water comes out of the rock and has never stopped. Every single thing that happened at Jericho happened because of that spring. Nobody builds a town in that valley for the view. They build it because there is water, and water in that place means gardens and dates and balsam and a road worth controlling. So here is the question this whole story comes down to, and put your answer in the comments before you hear mine. 4 careful people dug this same mound, and each of them came back with a different century for the same burnt wall. When the ground and the calendar disagree, which one do you trust? See whether you still think the same thing by the end. The first man to put a spade into the mound was a British Army officer called Charles Warren, and he did it in 1868. Warren was a royal engineer working for the Palestine Exploration Fund, and he was one of the most capable field men of his generation. He had already tunneled under Jerusalem, in the dark, in shafts he cut himself, and there is a water shaft under the Temple Mount that carries his name to this day. When he came to Jericho, he did what a 19th century engineer did. He sank vertical shafts down into the mound, several of them straight down, looking for something. He found almost nothing. He wrote that the mound did not appear to contain anything of interest, and he moved on. There is something worth sitting with in that, and it is not a criticism of Warren. One of his shafts went down within a few yards of that Neolithic stone tower. He missed it by the width of a room. And the reason he missed it is not that he was careless, but that he was looking for the wrong kind of thing in the wrong kind of way. He was digging for monuments, for walls and gates and inscriptions, the way you would in Egypt. A tell does not give up its story to a vertical shaft. It gives it up in layers, read sideways, and nobody had worked that out yet. It is worth understanding what Warren had been sent out to do, because it explains the shape of his failure. The Palestine Exploration Fund had been founded 3 years earlier, in 1865, with the Archbishop of York in the chair and Queen Victoria as its patron, and its purpose was to survey the Holy Land properly, with instruments for the first time. That was a serious scientific undertaking, and it produced a magnificent result: a triangulated map of Western Palestine, sheet by sheet, at an accuracy nobody had approached before. Warren was one of its best men. But the fund was in the business of surveying and identifying, of putting a name to a ruin and a ruin on a map, and identification is not excavation. Nobody in 1868 yet knew how to make a mound talk. And that is not a figure of speech. The single technique that turned digging into a dating science had not been invented yet, and when it arrived at another mound in the same country 22 years later. In 1890, at Tel El Hessi, an Englishman named Flinders Petrie cut into the side of a tell and noticed something that had been in front of everybody for a generation. The broken pottery in the lower layers was not the same as the broken pottery in the upper layers. Shapes changed, handles moved, rims thickened and thinned. And crucially, the change ran in one direction only, steadily, layer after layer, because fashions in ordinary household pots drift the way fashions always drift and never drift back exactly. That meant that a heap of worthless, broken crockery, which every previous excavator had shoveled aside to get at the walls, was in fact a clock. Not a clock that tells you a year. A clock that tells you order and relative distance, and if you can pin any one layer to a fixed date from somewhere else, the whole sequence above and below it acquires dates too. This is why the argument at Jericho is an argument about pottery, and it is why it can never be an argument about the walls themselves. Stone does not carry a date. A wall is only as old as the layer it was built from, and the layer is only as old as the pots in it. Everybody who has ever dated anything at Tel El Sultan has done it, in the end, by looking at broken cooking pots. Hold on to that, because it is the mechanism underneath every disagreement that follows. 40 years later, a joint German and Austrian expedition came back, and they did work sideways. Ernst Sellin and Karl Watzinger dug at the Tell from 1907 to 1909, and they were the first people to see the shape of the thing. What they found was walls, 2 of them, in fact, running around the Tell. There was a substantial stone wall at the bottom of the slope, and above it, set back, a wall of mud brick. And they found that in places, the mud brick had come down. Sellin and Watzinger published, and their first conclusion was that this destruction belonged to the late Bronze Age, which is to say somewhere around the 14th century before Christ. That was a considerable thing to say at the time, because it lined up with the traditional dating of Joshua. And then in 1911, having gone back over the pottery, they revised it. The walls, they now said, were older, Middle Bronze Age. Not the 14th century at all. That is the first time it happens, and it is worth marking because it happens again and again. The stones do not move, the interpretation does. 2 careful excavators looked at the same wall twice and gave 2 different centuries for it, 4 years apart, and the thing that changed their minds was pottery. Then came John Garstang, and Garstang is the one whose name most people have heard. Garstang was a British archaeologist, professor of methods and practice of archaeology at Liverpool, and he dug at Jericho for 6 seasons from 1930 to 1936. He was working with money from Charles Marston, a businessman who was frankly hoping the dig would confirm the Bible, and it is only fair to say that Garstang knew what his patron wanted. It is also fair to say that what he actually found in the ground was remarkable by any standard. He found a destruction layer. Not a thin scatter of ash, but a thick blanket of burning, in places approaching a meter deep, of charcoal and reddened brick and collapsed roofing, lying across the city. Whatever happened at Jericho, it burned, and it burned comprehensively. He found the walls fallen. On the north side of the tell in particular, Garstang recorded a stretch of the outer mud brick wall which had collapsed outwards and down the slope, so that the broken brick lay heaped against the base of the stone revetment below it, forming a ramp of rubble running up to what was left of the defences. It is worth being precise about what Garstang meant by that fallen wall, because the phrase has been used loosely ever since, and the record itself is quite specific. He numbered the successive cities in the mound, and the one he was concerned with he called City 4. Its defences on the north side consisted, as they did all round, of the stone revetment at the foot of the slope, with the mud brick wall standing above and behind it. What his sections showed was that the brickwork of the upper wall had come down outwards, over the top of the stone, and had piled up against the outer face of the revetment in a mass of broken brick deep enough to climb. That is a particular way for a wall to fail, and it is not the usual one. A wall that is undermined tends to slump inwards into the cavity beneath it. A wall taken down deliberately by an occupying force tends to be pushed inwards too, because that is where the men doing the work are standing. Brick coming down outwards, away from the town and down the slope, is the signature of a wall pushed from behind or shaken off its footing. Garstang read that as collapse. Kenyon later read the same heaped brick as material that had eroded and slipped down the face of the mound over a long period, which is a perfectly reasonable thing for the outside of a mud brick mound to do. Both of them were looking at the same rubble, which is, once again, the whole story of this site in one paragraph, and he found the grain. This is the detail that has never gone away, and it is worth being careful and plain about it, because it is the strongest single fact in the whole excavation. In the burnt houses, Garstang found storage jars, and in the storage jars there was grain, not a handful. Substantial quantities of it, carbonized by the fire that destroyed the buildings, still sitting where it had been stored. Think about what that means in ordinary terms. A city under siege eats its grain. That is what a siege does. It is a competition to see who runs out of food first, and a long siege ends with empty storerooms. And a city taken by an army is stripped, because grain is the single most valuable portable thing in the ancient world. An attacking force in the Bronze Age did not burn the granaries. It carried them off. It was payment. So a burnt city with its jars, still full, tells you two things at once. It tells you the siege was short, because the grain had not been eaten. And it tells you the victors did not take the food, which is an unusual and specific thing for a victorious army to decide. Garstang did something else that is less famous and turned out to matter more than the walls. He dug the cemetery. West and north of the tell, cut into the soft rock of the hillsides, there is a necropolis of rock-cut tombs, and Garstang excavated a considerable number of them. A tomb is a far better dating instrument than a town, and the reason is simple. A town layer is a rubbish heap that people walked on for a century, with older material trodden up into it and later material dug down into it. A tomb is a sealed group. Someone was laid in a chamber on one day, with pots and lamps and scarabs placed beside them, and the entrance was blocked, and unless the tomb was robbed, nothing else ever entered it. Everything in that chamber belongs together. So the tomb groups from Jericho became a fixed reference for the pottery of the whole region, and they are still cited. Garstang, whatever anyone thinks of his chronology of the walls, handed the discipline a body of sealed, dated groups that other excavators have been calibrating against ever since. Kenyon later dug more of the same cemetery and used it in exactly the same way, and some of her most important publications are the tomb reports rather than the town reports. There is a small, human detail in those tombs worth mentioning as we go past. In several of the Middle Bronze chambers, the burial goods included furniture, wooden tables and stools and beds, preserved by the dry conditions, along with baskets, combs, boxes and dishes of food. People were sent into the rock with their household around them. 3,500 years later, somebody brushed the dust off a wooden stool, and it was still a stool. Garstang put his destruction at about 1400 before Christ. He published it, Marston publicized it, and for the better part of 20 years, the walls of Jericho were considered, in a good many books, to have been dug up and dated. And then a woman arrived at the mound with a notebook and changed the entire discipline. Kathleen Kenyon had grown up inside the subject. Her father, Frederick Kenyon, was director of the British Museum and one of the great scholars of ancient manuscripts, so she was raised among the objects and the arguments. She read history at Oxford, and then she went to work, first in southern Rhodesia at Great Zimbabwe, and then at Samaria in Palestine in the 1930s, and then at Verulamium, the Roman town under modern St. Albans, where she dug alongside Mortimer Wheeler for 6 seasons. She was, by every account of people who worked for her, formidable, direct, and not much interested in being liked. She was also, at a time when this was still unusual, running her own excavations and training the people who would run the next generation of them. When she came to Jericho, she was in her early 50s, and she had been digging for a quarter of a century. Kathleen Kenyon dug at Jericho from 1952 to 1958, and to understand what she did there, you have to understand what she brought with her. Kenyon had trained under Mortimer Wheeler at Verulamium, and together they had developed a way of digging that is now simply how archaeology is done. It is called the Wheeler-Kenyon method, and the idea behind it is deceptively simple. Instead of clearing a building or chasing a wall, you lay out a grid of square trenches, and between the squares you leave standing walls of unexcavated earth called baulks. As you dig each square down, the face of the baulk beside you records every single layer you have cut through, in order, in section, like the edge of a sliced cake. You draw it, you photograph it, and the drawing, not the object, becomes your evidence because the drawing shows what was above what. That sounds like bookkeeping. It is actually the difference between an opinion and a proof. Before it, an excavator could say a pot was found near a wall. After it, an excavator has to show which layer the pot was in and which layer the wall was cut from. And if the answer is that the pot was in a layer above the wall, then no amount of enthusiasm about the pot can date the wall. Kenyon applied that to Jericho, and three things came out of it. The first was the tower. Cutting down through the western side of the mound, she went below everything anyone had expected to find, past the Bronze Age, past the pottery, and into a Neolithic town with a stone wall around it, and that great round tower built against the inside of the wall. Radiocarbon put it around 8,000 before Christ. That is roughly 5,000 years before writing. It is one of the most important discoveries in the archaeology of the entire ancient world, and it had been sitting a few yards from Charles Warren's shaft for 80 years. The second was the skulls. In the Neolithic levels, Kenyon found human skulls which had been carefully separated from the bodies, packed with earth, and then had faces built onto them in plaster, with shells set into the eye sockets. They are startling to look at even now. They are among the oldest portraits of human beings that exist anywhere, and whatever they meant to the people who made them, they meant it enough to keep those faces in the house. It is worth staying down at that level for a moment, because the Neolithic town Kenyon uncovered is a genuinely strange and moving thing, and it tends to get hurried past on the way to the argument. The people who built that wall and that tower were among the very first human beings anywhere to stop moving. They were growing barley and wheat and pulses at the edge of farming, and they had not yet invented pottery, which is why the period is called pre-pottery Neolithic. They lived in round houses with floors of hard, burnished plaster. And when somebody in the household died, in a great many cases they buried them under the floor of the house and went on living above them. That is the context for the plastered skulls. A head was taken up again after burial and given back a face in plaster with shells for eyes, and then kept. Not hidden in a tomb, kept in the house with the family above the floor. Whatever the theology of it was, and we have no way at all of knowing, the impulse is not difficult to recognize. These are people who could not bear to let a face go. As for the tower itself, the honest answer to what it was remains that nobody knows. It has been read as a defensive keep, and it may be. It has also been argued by the archaeologist Ofer Bar Yosef, among others, that the Great Wall at the base was not built against people at all, but against water and mud, a barrier thrown up on the uphill side to protect the settlement from the debris flows that come off the hills in a wet winter. And it has been suggested that the tower was a communal monument or a marker aligned on the hills to the west. What is certain is only that a community of a few hundred people, with no metal, no writing and no wheel, decided that this structure was worth the labor of quarrying, hauling and stacking many hundreds of tons of stone. And the third thing was the redating, which is the part everybody argues about. Kenyon looked at Garstang's fallen walls, applied her sections, and concluded that they were not 14th century at all. They were not even Middle Bronze. Those particular walls, she said, belonged to the early Bronze Age, some 900 years before Garstang's date. The Great Destruction, the burnt layer with the grain in it, she assigned to the end of the Middle Bronze Age, somewhere around 1550 before Christ. And then she said the thing that made it a controversy rather than a correction. In the late Bronze Age, she said, the period of the traditional date for Joshua, there was effectively nothing there. No city wall in use, a little occupation, a building or two, a scatter of material, and then a long gap. On her reading, the town that was destroyed had been destroyed a century and a half too early, and by the 14th century, Jericho was a ruin with a few people living on it. Now here is what her argument actually rested on, because this matters and it is almost always skipped. Kenyon's case was built substantially on what she did not find. In the 15th and 14th centuries before Christ, the Eastern Mediterranean was full of a very distinctive imported pottery from Cyprus, decorated by chrome ware, and it turns up on late bronze sites all over the region. It is the pottery equivalent of a dated stamp. Kenyon dug her squares at Jericho, and that imported pottery was not in them. If a town is occupied when everyone else in the region is buying Cypriot pots, she reasoned, some Cypriot pots end up in the town. There were none. Therefore, there was no town. That is a real argument. It is also an argument from absence, and arguments from absence are only as strong as the ground you dug. And the ground she dug was, by her own account, a very deep and very narrow window. Her main trench on the west side went down through the full height of the mound, more than 40 feet of superimposed towns, which is why she reached the Neolithic at all. But a trench that goes very deep cannot also go very wide, and everything she concluded about what was and was not present in a given century came out of that limited footprint. And there is a further thing under all of this that is rarely said out loud, which is that the calendar itself is borrowed. When an archaeologist in Palestine says late Bronze Age, or says 14th century before Christ, that date does not come from Palestine. There are no king lists from Jericho. There are no annals from Canaan giving regnal years. The entire chronology of the region is pinned, ultimately, to Egypt, because Egypt kept lists of its kings and recorded astronomical observations, and because Egyptian objects with royal names on them traveled and turn up in other people's rubbish. So the sequence works like this. A scarab bearing the name of an Egyptian king is found in a sealed tomb group. The Egyptian king can be placed in a reign. The reign can be placed in a dynasty. The dynasty can be placed against the Egyptian calendar. And so the pots that were buried alongside that scarab acquire a date, and every layer containing those pots acquires a date, all the way across the region. It is an impressive structure, and it is also a chain, and a chain has joints. Egyptologists have argued for a century about the length of certain intermediate periods, and about how much overlap there was between dynasties ruling at the same time in different places, and the differences are not trivial. So when the ground at Jericho gives a century, and the expected reading gives another, one of the possibilities that has to be kept honestly on the table is that some part of the borrowed calendar is out. That is not a way of rescuing a conclusion. It is simply an accurate description of how much weight a very long chain is being asked to carry. One thing before we go on. If you subscribe, it genuinely helps this channel, and there is a new one every day, walking through the life of Jesus. In 1990, more than 30 years after Kenyon finished and precisely, because she had published her sections so thoroughly, an American archaeologist named Bryant Wood went back through her own field notes and made the counter-argument in print. Wood's case had several parts. He pointed out that Kenyon had excavated a very small area, essentially a few squares on a mound of 10 acres, and that she had dug in a poor quarter of the town where imported luxury pottery would be least likely to appear in the first place. He argued that the local pottery from the destruction layer, which Kenyon had largely set aside, carried later features than her date allowed. And he pointed to Garstang's material and to a radiocarbon determination on charcoal from the destruction, and argued for a date around 1400 after all. The reply came in 1995, and it came from the laboratory rather than the trench. Hendrik Bruins and Johannes van der Plicht published a set of radiocarbon measurements on samples from the destruction layer at Jericho, using accelerator dating on short-lived material, and their results clustered on a date in the region of 1560 before Christ. That is Kenyan's date, not Garstang's, and it is the piece of evidence that most working archaeologists now regard as decisive. And there the professional argument has largely rested. The mainstream position is that the Great Burning at Jericho belongs to about 1550 before Christ, at the end of the Middle Bronze Age, and that the Late Bronze town was small. But there is a genuine complication that nobody on any side disputes, and it deserves to be said plainly rather than used as a weapon. The top of the Tell has largely washed away. Tel Es Sultan is a steep mound of mud brick and earth, standing in a valley that gets sudden, violent winter rain, and it has been standing there exposed for 3,500 years. The most recent layers, the ones nearest the surface, are the ones erosion removes first. That is not special pleading. Kenyan herself said it. The late bronze levels, the very layers that would settle the question, are precisely the layers that a mound of that shape is least likely to have kept. Garstang found a small structure on the summit that he called the middle building, of late bronze date. Kenyan found a late bronze juglet and a small patch of occupation. That is very nearly the whole of the evidence for that period at Jericho, from 4 excavations. It is not much to build a city on, and it is not much to prove an absence with either. So what is the honest state of it? The honest state of it is that the ground gives 1 century, and a good many readers of the text expect another, and the gap between them is about 150 years, and the most likely places for that gap to hide are a chronology built on Egyptian king lists and a hilltop that the rain took away. That is a real disagreement between careful people, and it has not been settled by anybody shouting. Now let us go back to what is not in dispute, because there is far more of it than the argument suggests, and it is the part worth taking away. Nobody disputes that there is a walled town at Jericho of extraordinary antiquity. Not disputed, not marginal, not a matter of interpretation. There is a stone wall and a stone tower at the bottom of that mound built around 8,000 years before Christ, and it means that at Jericho, human beings were living behind a defensive wall 4,000 years before the first cities of Mesopotamia and 5,000 years before writing. Whatever else Jericho is, it is one of the places where the settled life of the human race begins. Nobody disputes the spring. The water is still coming out of the ground at 1,000 gallons a minute, which is why there is a town there today, which is why there was a town there 9,000 years ago, and which is why there is a mound with 20 towns in it. Nobody disputes the size of the place. The Tell is about 10 acres. That is small. A Bronze Age town on that footprint would hold perhaps 1,000 people, perhaps 2, with fields and gardens outside it fed by the spring. When you picture Jericho, the picture ought to be a compact fortified town on a low mound with palm groves around it, not a great metropolis. The name has grown in the telling, and the ground quietly corrects it. Nobody disputes the defenses either, and they are worth describing properly because the shape of them is unusual. At the base of the slope, there was a stone revetment wall, several meters high, holding back the mound itself. Above that, the slope was faced with a hard plastered rampart, sloping and slippery, designed so that nothing could be pushed up it. And on top of that, at the crest, stood a wall of mud brick. So an attacker at Jericho faced a stone footing, then a steep plastered glacis, and only then the wall proper. That is a serious piece of military engineering for a small town, and it tells you how much the spring was worth to whoever held it. Nobody disputes the burning. Every excavator who has cut into that mound has come out with the same thick layer of ash and collapsed brick and heat-trodden debris. The town was destroyed by fire, thoroughly, and not once. Jericho burned more than once across its history. That is normal for a tell. Being destroyed and rebuilt is how a mound gets to be 70 feet tall. And nobody disputes the grain. Garstang found it, Kenyon found it, and Kenyon, who spent 6 years dismantling Garstang's chronology, confirmed his most striking single observation without hesitation. Her own excavation recovered so much stored grain from the destruction that she remarked on it herself. She did not doubt the grain. She simply dated it to a different century. Sit with that for a moment, because it is the most interesting thing in the whole affair. The two people whose disagreement defines this subject agreed completely about the most unusual fact in the ground. A city was taken and burned with its food still in the jars, and the people who took it did not stop to carry the food away. That is unusual behavior for an army in any century you care to put it in. There is one more thing worth saying about the houses on the wall. On the north side of the tell, Garstang recorded a stretch where domestic buildings had been constructed right up against and partly over the line of the city wall, so that the outer wall of the house was the city wall. That is not a mysterious arrangement. It is what happens in a crowded walled town where land is short and the wall is the only surface left to build against, and it is found at other sites. But it is worth knowing that at Jericho, in the excavated record, there were people living in houses built into the wall itself, because the picture most of us carry is of a bare rampart with soldiers on it, and the reality of a small Bronze Age town is that the fortification was also somebody's back wall, and somebody's roof, and somebody's window looking out over the plain. And it is worth saying that the digging did not stop with Kenyon. Since 1997, a joint expedition from the Sapienza University of Rome and the Palestinian Department of Antiquities, directed for most of that time by the archaeologist Lorenzo Nigro, has been working at Tel Es Sultan season after season, with instruments Kenyon never had. They have re-examined the early bronze town, traced the successive lines of fortification, worked on the palace area and the spring, and published steadily. That is the ordinary shape of archaeology, and it is the opposite of how the subject is usually presented. There was no final expedition that closed the file. There is a mound in the Jordan Valley with people on it most years, taking a little more of it apart very slowly and writing down what they find. The argument about the 15th and 14th centuries has not been abandoned. It has simply been handed on alongside a great deal of other work to people who are still on the site. So, where does that leave the mound? It leaves it as one of the most thoroughly dug and most honestly argued sites in the archaeology of the ancient Near East. In 2023, the tell was inscribed on the World Heritage List, which is a recognition not of the argument, but of the antiquity underneath it. And it leaves us with 4 people, each of whom did their work properly by the standards they had. Charles Warren, sinking shafts in 1868, found nothing and said so, and his honesty about finding nothing is worth more than a confident guess would have been. He was within yards of the oldest tower on Earth, and he walked away rather than invent something. Selin and Watzinger found the walls, published a date, went back to their pottery, and corrected themselves in print 4 years later. That is not a failure. That is exactly what the work is supposed to look like. Garstang found the burning and the grain and the fallen brick, and those are still there, still real, still the physical facts everybody else has had to account for, whatever they thought of his chronology. And Kenyon built the method by which all of it can be checked, including the parts of it that disagreed with her. She published her sections in such detail that a man who thought she was wrong could take her own notebooks apart 30 years later and make his case out of her own evidence. There are not many disciplines where that is possible. It is possible in archaeology substantially because of her. So when people ask what archaeology has to say about the walls of Jericho, the answer is not a yes, and it is not a no. The answer is a mound 70 feet deep, a spring that has never stopped, the oldest town wall in the world, plastered faces from 9,000 years ago, a stone revetment with brick collapsed at the foot of it, a meter of burning, jars of grain that nobody took, and a 150-year gap in a calendar that nobody has yet closed. The stones have not moved since the day they fell. Everything that has changed in 120 years has been our reading of them, and that is worth remembering the next time anyone tells you that a question of this kind has been finally settled in either direction. The tower is still there at the bottom of the mound, with its 22 steps running up inside it. It was old when Abraham was young. Nobody knows whether it was a defense, or a shrine, or a flood barrier, or a marker for a calendar, and the people who built it left no writing of any kind, because writing had not been invented yet and would not be for another 5,000 years. They cut the stone, they laid it without mortar, they built a staircase inside a solid tower for a reason that mattered to them very much. And it is still standing.